Thanks for attending this talk. My name is Himanshu, and I'm going to present an approach to model cross-linguistic differences using individual level parametric variation in a model of sentence processing. And using this approach, how can we answer a question of theoretical interest? So let's first talk about the question that we are interested in here. So consider the following pair of sentences. The resident who said that the neighbor was dangerous was complaining versus the sentence the resident who was living near the dangerous neighbor was complaining. A consistent observation is that the readers have difficulty in comprehending sentence A compared to sentence B. Specifically, at the verb was complaining, the reading times are slower in condition A compared to condition D. The question is why? Well, a possible reason is this, that both the nouns in sentence A are in the subject position. So they share a syntactic feature, and this shared syntactic feature among nouns cause so-called syntactic interference. So is there a theory that can explain this syntactic interference? Well, there is. So a prominent explanation is Q-based retrieval. The idea is this, that in order to identify the target nouns, right, when the readers encounter this verb was complaining, they initiate a search in memory based on the feature specification of the verb. For example, here, they use this feature specification of subject to search for a noun which is in subject position. Now in sentence A, there are two nouns which are in subject position, right? So the subject position shared, let's say in these two nouns, and due to this shared feature, it is difficult to identify the correct target noun. And because of this, a so-called fan effect arises, which causes a slowdown in retrieving the correct target noun, the verb. So the Q-based retrieval explains the syntactic interference in reading. But Q-based retrieval also predicts another kind of interference when the nouns match in terms of semantic feature, right? So let's see what are the observations for these kind of sentences. For example, in sentence C versus sentence D. So in sentence C, the resident and the noun the neighbor, they share animacy feature, right? And the verb was complaining expects a noun with animate feature, right? Now in sentence C, there are two nouns that have animate feature, so this should also cause interference during reading. So that's the prediction of the Q-based retrieval model. So do we observe the semantic interference? Well, the semantic interference prediction supported by English data from a study by Van Dyke 2007 and more recent replication study by Mertzen and colleagues. But this prediction is not supported by German data. So the reading times of the verb in German data do not support semantic interference prediction. This is how the pattern of results look like from the recent study, that you see both semantic and syntactic interference for English, but you see only syntactic interference for German. So the question is, what causes this sort of pattern that you see both kind of interference in English, but only syntactic interference in German? Well, a possible explanation is suggested by in the same recent paper, and the explanation is this, that probably the linguistic information available during processing is used differently by English and German speakers. So for example, it is possible that syntactic information is preferred over semantic information during processing in German, was to say syntactic information is given more weight compared to semantic information, while both these kind of information are given equal preference during processing in English. Well, this explanation is not new. This similar kind of proposal have been there in terms of processing difference between two constructions. For example, it has been proposed that for certain constructions, syntactic cues may be weighted more strongly than non-syntactic cues during retrieval. For example, for reflexive dependencies, it has been proposed that structural cue is probably weighted more strongly over the number cue during processing. And they use this sort of proposal to explain processing differences between reflexive dependencies and subject-verb agreement dependencies. So, so to answer the question why semantic interference of the verb is found in English but not in German, this is the basically the explanation can be termed as the Q-weighting explanation, and it has been also proposed for processing differences between two constructions. Now, a problem with this explanation is that this explanation has been made to explain the average behavior, right? So to explain the difference between average behavior in English versus German, or to explain average behavior in reflexive dependencies or agreement dependencies. So this sort of claims that are made to explain the average behavior, they mask a theoretically important detail. And the detail is this, that the individuals may differ in weighting of syntactic cues over non-syntactic cues. For example, it could be the case that some individuals give higher weightage to the syntactic cue over non-syntactic cue, while some individuals may give equal weighting to syntactic or non-syntactic cues. And it has been demonstrated in one of our previous work that the distribution of individual level Q weighting can differ between two constructions. For example, in subject-verb agreement constructions, all the participants have equal Q weighting for syntactic and non-syntactic cues. While in case of reflexive constructions, only 3/4 of participants have equal Q weighting. So now the question arises that, is it possible that the distribution of individual level Q weighting differs across two language population? And is that the reason we see these differences in English and German? Now, how to test this? So I'm going to introduce the varying Q weighting hypothesis. So hypothesis is simple, that it states that individuals differ in weighting of syntactic cues relative to non-syntactic cues, right? So for example, some individuals can give equal weights to both kind of cues, and some individuals can give, let's say, 2 times higher weight to syntactic cues. Some individual can give 3 times higher weight. So like that. So it's like a, it can take a continuous value in terms of ratio of these two kinds of cues. So these are the possibilities under the varying Q weighting hypothesis, that the distribution of individual level Q weighting can differ across two language populations, right? So it is possible that most German speakers have higher Q weighting, while most English speakers have equal Q weighting. I'm highlighting this specific possibility because it is possible due to overt case marking in German that probably syntactic cues were used more frequently and reliably in the past. So the predictions of the hypothesis, so these are two predictions. The individuals differ in weighting of syntactic cues relative to non-syntactic cues, and the distribution of individual level Q weighting may differ across two language populations. So how do we test this hypothesis? So we are going to model individual differences in syntactic and semantic interference in these two languages as parametric variation in the Q weighting parameter of the Q-based retrieval model. So we are going to test two models, the varying Q weighting model and the equal Q weighting model. So the equal Q weighting model assumes that all the participants have equal weighting for syntactic and semantic cues. So precisely the assumption is this, that if there is any difference in syntactic and semantic interference, it should be just because of differences in reading speed, not because of differences in Q weighting. While the varying Q weighting model assumes that participants differ in relative weighting of syntactic cues, and that could derive the differences in syntactic and semantic interference. So we are going to compare the performance of these two models using base factor analysis, and we're going to use the data from Murchison and colleagues. And the way we draw inference is this: if varying Q weighting model has superior performance, then there is evidence in favor of the hypothesis that individuals differ in terms of Q weighting. Just to highlight that, of course, the Q weighting is varying between 1 to 4. It's a continuous value. So 1 means that syntactic and semantic cues are given equal weight, and 4 means there is 4 times higher weight to syntactic cue or semantic cue. So this is how the assumptions would look like. If on x-axis there is Q weighting, on y-axis there is each individual. So equal Q weighting model would assume that all these participants, all these individuals have exactly Q weighting 1, that is equal weights for syntactic and semantic Q. Varying Q weighting model assumes that they could vary the individuals could vary, and these distributions would differ across two language populations. And of course, we are going to check the prior sensitivity, as base factors can be very sensitive to the priors on parameters of interest, which are population level Q weighting, the mean Q weighting, and the between individual variance in Q weighting. So here are the base factor results. So we can see that the base factor values are somewhere between 5 to 10 under different assumptions on mean Q weighting. And this indicates that there is moderate to strong evidence in favor of the varying Q weighting hypothesis. And what it indicates is that individuals differ in the weighting of syntactic Q over semantic Qs. We can also see the parameter estimate, the individual level estimates of Q weighting from the varying Q weighting model. And this is how these estimates look like. So for English speakers, we can see that most of the individuals have low Q weighting of less than 1.5, which suggests that they have approximately equal Q weighting, while most German speakers have high weighting for the syntactic Q. And this pattern is, of course, consistent with the average behavior in this case, but it could differ widely in some cases. So what we infer from these findings is that, well, there is evidence in favor of the varying Q weighting model, and most German participants have higher Q weighting. They give higher weights to syntactic Qs, while most English speakers have approximately equal Q weighting. And the interesting point from the last set of results is that, well, you can see that although individuals differ, the distribution is also different in these two populations. So using this distribution of individual level parameter estimates, we can draw inferences about differences between two populations. So we are not just relying on the average parameter estimates here, we are using the information from the distribution of individual level parameter estimates. So what did we learn about the underlying process from this study? Well, first, individuals may differ in the uses of linguistic information. Second, speakers from different language populations may differ in how they use linguistic information. And it supports the idea that native speakers of a language may learn to use certain cues more strongly and reliably over the others. And this idea has some support in previous literature. Finally, the syntactic and semantic interference and comprehension are possibly caused by a Q-based retrieval process where cues are weighted differently among individuals. This project can, of course, take interesting directions, but there is one important open question that we often try to ensure that whether the inferences drawn from a sample are generalizable to the population. But an important question that remains unresolved is this: whether the inferences drawn for a population are generalizable to an individual of the population. And this question is important because we are not just interested in an average abstract mind, we are interested in an individual mind as well. And this leads us to these two paths of inquiry into human mind. First, what is the underlying process that generates the average behavior of the population, the average behavior that we infer from a sample? And of course, this approach is well developed in sentence processing. It's fast, easy to operationalize. But the problem is this, that it can lead to oversimplification and in some cases, even inaccurate generalization of the underlying process. Second approach that we take in this work is this, that what is the underlying process that generates the observed distribution of individual level behavior in the population? So again, we can use the same sample, but rather than taking average behavior, we can take the distribution of individual level behavior to infer about the underlying process. Now, of course, this is challenging because we may need different sort of experiment. We need a lot of trials for each individual, and there is a problem of reliability. This is indeed challenging, but we need this approach to complement approach one and to build more accurate description of the underlying processes. Thank you very much. I would be happy to take your questions.